Welcome back to the London Futurist podcast. Craig Kaplan has been thinking about superintelligence longer than most. He bought the URL superintelligence.com back in 2006. And many years before that, in the late 1980s, he co-authored a series of papers with one of the founding fathers of AI, Herbert Simon. Craig started his career as a scientist with IBM and later founded and ran a venture-backed company called PredictWallStreet that brought the wisdom of the crowd to Wall Street and improved the performance of leading hedge funds. He sold that company in 2020 and now spends his time working out how to make the first superintelligence safe. As he puts it, he wants to reduce P-doom and increase P-zoom. Craig, welcome to the London Futurist podcast.
Callum, great to be here with you and David.
Many thanks for joining us, Craig.
It's my pleasure.
So Craig, tell us about working with Herb Simon. What was he like? And did you think at the time that he had helped start the world on a march towards superintelligence?
When I first worked with Herb as a graduate student, I was about 21 years old, and I think he was about 68. So for me, it was really like going in and sitting down with a friendly grandfather that was very excited about science. It was one of the best periods of my life. He was the consummate scientist, extremely intelligent, very rigorous in his thinking, and at the same time retained that childlike curiosity that good scientists have. So I really had a ball. And it was also kind of a magical period for AI in general, because at the same time that Herb and I were working together on symbolic AI, Jay McClelland, who's a colleague of Jeff Hinton, and David Rumelhart, they were sort of inventing the neural network approach that is now underpinning most of modern AI. So you had both camps going on simultaneously. It was just kind of a golden period. It was very, very exciting.
Did you think then that superintelligence was the rainbow at the end of the path of gold?
I don't think anyone really used the term superintelligence. Maybe there were a few. Certainly Herb didn't use that term. In fact, even the term artificial intelligence was not his first choice. He was a member of that founding group in 1956. There was that famous Dartmouth conference where the field was named. John McCarthy, Marvin Minsky, Claude Shannon, the real luminaries of the field were all there. And they decided upon the name of artificial intelligence. I think Herb would have preferred something like complex information processing or something, because he really viewed cognitive systems as information processing systems. So he, I think, was way ahead of his time. Of all those scientists, all these luminary scientists in 1956, Herb Simon and Alan Newell were the only two that actually brought a working AI system. So everyone else was debating, what do we call the field? And they were like, hey guys, we built it. Even more than that, and something that's still debated today, is the idea of, can AI be creative? A lot of people think, well, it's fine to answer questions, but it will never be capable of creative thought. Herb, way back in 1956, that program that they presented at that conference, which was called The Logic Theorist, actually was creative. It came up with a brand new mathematical proof that was not programmed into it by simply exploring from the information that it did contain. He took that proof and actually wrote a letter to Russell and Whitehead, famous logicians, and said, hey, we have a new proof for one of your theorems out of Principia Mathematica. And they said, wow, we didn't think of that. We wish we had. So it really was a high quality creative output way back in 1956. So in that sense, Herb had no doubt that AI was going to be capable of creative thought, and probably had the term superintelligence been around, it would not have surprised him at all to hear that's where we're headed.
One thing for which Herb Simon has become famous or even infamous is that about the same time period, I think it was November 1957 at a conference in Pittsburgh, he looked ahead 10 years and he said, well, within 10 years, a digital computer will be the world's chess champion. A digital computer will discover and prove an important new mathematical theorem. A digital computer will write music that will be accepted by critics as possessing considerable aesthetic value. So I think, despite his other brilliance, he got some of these predictions wrong. Is that fair?
I think you're right. And he would be the first to admit that his track record on timing was not the best. I think he joked, it's always 10 years from where you are. which is something you sometimes hear in industry with self-driving cars, although it's usually not 10 years, it's usually next year. So yeah, predicting the timing on these things is incredibly difficult. I think at one point he started lengthening it. So he'd say within the next 50 years, we'll achieve this. But there's no doubt that he had expected us to have made more progress than we did by the time of his death, which was 2001. And I think the reason that, as your listeners probably know, AI has gone through cycles of incredible excitement and productivity. And then there was an AI winter sort of in the 90s, and then this resurgence that we've experienced now. One of the things that has been consistently underestimated in the field of artificial intelligence is how difficult it is to build systems that are capable of dealing with all of the complexity in the world. For a toy problem like chess, or even proving a theorem, it's very well constrained and you know what the rules are, and you can have AI systems very early on. But when it comes to self-driving cars, we're still just about there. And that's because of the complexity. That's just something that comes with the territory. But now I think we really are on the cusp of exponential increases. It's very exciting.
Amara's law does tend to get everybody, the idea that we overestimate the impact of technology in the short term and underestimate it in the long term. Oddly, it might be Ray Kurzweil who defeats that law if some of the luminaries in big AI are right and the prediction that superintelligence arrives in 2029 proved to be correct. It'd be quite astonishing how accurate Kurzweil has been for many decades. We will see how that goes. Let's move on to PredictWallStreet. How did you bring the wisdom of the crowds to Wall Street? And how did that company change over the 15 years that you ran it?
Actually, that company has its roots way back with those AI researchers in the 80s. Marvin Minsky, although he was not at Carnegie Mellon, was very active at the same time that Herb and Jay McClellan and these other folks were doing research. And he wrote a book called Society of Mind, which perhaps some of your listeners are familiar with. The thesis of that book is that you can have a high level of intelligence that arises from the interactions of many lesser intelligences. In other words, a collective intelligence approach. You can have a lot of not so smart intelligences, but if you hook them up in the right way, you can get something that's potentially very intelligent or maybe even super intelligent. And I think I myself, along with many of my fellow graduate students, we were all captivated by this idea and trying to figure out, how do we actually implement this? Minsky, unfortunately, was a little sketchy on that point. There's lots of inspirational ideas, but not a lot of concrete instructions on how to build this or how it would all work. So when it came to PredictWallStreet, by that time in my career, I had become convinced that this collective intelligence approach could really work. And I was looking around for the most difficult real-world problem I could find. It had to be a very competitive problem, and it had to be one where there was a very clear way of keeping score and knowing how well you were doing. And then at the same time, I was married and had young kids, and I thought, boy, it would be nice to make some money at the same time. This is getting expensive. And so I thought, well, Wall Street. Actually, we had a brainstorming session, beer and pizza, and one of the interns at my consulting company said, well, what about Wall Street? And I thought, maybe. I knew nothing about Wall Street, but we thought maybe there are all these retail investors. If we could gather input from lots of their brains, there might be a way to put it together and actually get an edge that the pros on Wall Street didn't have. So that was the original idea. I thought it had sound scientific backing because there was Minsky. After all, he had talked about collective intelligence, and Herb Simon talked about bounded rationality, which is what he got his Nobel Prize for in economics in 1978, or at least one of the things. And the idea of bounded rationality is that any one brain can only hold so much information. There's cognitive processing limits, and therefore humans don't act completely rationally. Their action is bounded and limited. So I thought, well, on Wall Street, no one genius on Wall Street can have all that information. They have bounded rationality. But if we could have millions of people, each one knows a little bit about the market, and if we could somehow synthesize that information, we could overcome the limits of bounded rationality. So those were the initial ideas that got me interested. I poured a lot of my own savings and the money we made from consulting into building a prototype. We ran experiments. And then about 2000, we got amazing results. which looking back was partly due to luck. It happened to be when we ran the experiment, a time when the market just moved a lot and it looked like this thing just worked amazingly well.
You were predicting that the market was going up? Because in 2000 it was going up for a while.
Yes, it was. And there was a period of time where it just moved very dramatically. And so if you ran a statistical test, it looked like, my gosh, you have a real effect here.
And Greg, the data you were feeding into the model, was that simply the trades that the retail investors were making? Or did you have some other form of data out with that?
Yes, thank you for asking that question. Actually, we did not see the trades that retail guys did. What we did was we asked them what they thought. So for example, we all have brokerage accounts. TD Ameritrade and Schwab ended up being partners of PredictWallStreet. So let's say you had a Charles Schwab account and you put in a ticker symbol, NVIDIA, NVDA, up comes the chart for NVIDIA. Right underneath it would be a little widget that says, do you think NVIDIA is going up or down tomorrow, a week from now, 2 weeks from now? And you just clicked a single button, up or down. So that was the simplest possible input. What we were doing is we were mining your thoughts. We were getting a window into what people were thinking that they may not have acted on. And human psychology is such that, in particular, if you think it's going down, many people will not have sold. So that information is not in the market because they don't want to take the pain of selling, but they will tell you what they think. And when you aggregate all that information across millions of people, it turns out that there's information there that's not already in the market that can be used to trade on.
And is this kind of system still running? And is PredictWallStreet still running?
Well, I sold the company in 2020. It was a long haul. We all thought, as many young entrepreneurs do, that this will be 2 or 3 years and we'll cash out and this will be great. And instead, it dragged on for 14 years. And finally, in 2018, we actually were powering a hedge fund that was trading tens of millions of dollars. I think we traded a couple $1 billion worth of trades altogether. And we ranked in the top 10 of all a certain category of funds called market neutral funds. And then I felt like, okay, I've proved what I set out to prove. I didn't really want a career in Wall Street. I really want to do AI, improve collective intelligence. So I sold the company. And the terms of that deal were such that we don't really know what the buyer did. They were very, very private about it, as these Wall Street folks tend to be. But it's not operational as PredictWallStreet at the moment. They have the technology and they're using it however they use it.
So moving on to what you're doing now. The company you run now, IQ, is dedicated to designing safe superintelligence. And if you succeed in that, it might well be the most important thing anybody ever does. But is there a business model? Or did the sale of PredictWallStreet leave you in the enviable position of not having to worry about pesky things like money?
Well, definitely the sale enabled me to have control of my time and not have to work again, which is good. And to me, that's kind of a key milestone. And then the way I look at these things is there's sort of a hierarchy. At the top of the hierarchy is survival, making sure I survive, my family and friends survive, the human race survives. And then a distant second is, can we make tons of money off this? And at the moment, I have real concerns that there are some existential threats to the direction that advanced AI is going. Similar to Jeff Hinton when he quit Google and said, look, I'm going to give up whatever lucrative deal he had there so I can speak my mind very freely. I sort of made that same decision. I've had multiple opportunities to take venture capital and do this all over again. And I thought, no, you know what? I really need to try to get these designs out, make them freely available, just do whatever I can in whatever way is possible to get them adopted, or at least whatever ideas are useful, get those adopted. And I think there's 2 or 3 ideas that could really help, even if people don't build superintelligence exactly the way that I envision.
When you talk about existential threats from AI, many people, when they use that phrase, seem to have quite different ideas in mind. What is uppermost in your mind about that?
There are many dangers to AI, ranging from job loss and biases and discrimination and fake news and all these kinds of things. And those are all legitimate and valid threats. The one that I worry about is the one that ends humanity, makes us extinct. And that is potentially possible if you have a runaway system that becomes vastly more intelligent than humans and even all humans put together. And if that system is autonomous, and if that system ends up having values that are not aligned with humans or just doesn't care about humans. I think what happened when I sold PredictWallStreet, I looked around at the leaders and I was listening very carefully to what they were saying about this. And almost all of them acknowledge this. Most of them have signed the statement on AI safety that says advanced AI represents an existential risk alongside nuclear war and pandemics. Some of them have signed Max Tegmark's pause letter, which was well-intentioned, but unfortunately could not fight the forces of capitalism that are driving everybody to just build faster and faster. So I realized that there is a danger. The most likely case, I think, is everything is great. I think that's like 80%. But 20% is a really high probability that things go wrong to the point where humanity comes to an end. I heard Paul Tudor Jones recently, who is a very famous Wall Street risk manager. I think he was happy doing what he was doing. And then he went to a conference with some of the elites of the AI world, and they all shared their view that, yeah, no, maybe it's 10 to 20% that we're all dead. And he just thought that was crazy. No risk manager in their right mind would accept a 10% risk of it all being, I mean, that's crazy. And that's kind of how I felt too. I thought, okay, we got to do something. I knew from IBM, I had written a book on software quality, that an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. You can reduce all of software quality down to that one little statement. Therefore, designing things safely was the way to go. And that's not what we're doing right now. People are developing AI systems as fast as they can, and then they try to guardrail them and use reinforcement learning, which is kind of a game of whack-a-mole. If the AI says something bad, you ask it, how do I build a bioweapon? And it says, oh, here's how you do it. You say, no, you cannot do that. You're not allowed to talk about bioweapons. That's after the fact. That's not the way to build in safety.
Let's come on in a minute to your suggestions about how we make superintelligence safe. I'd like to dig into your optimism. You say your PDOOM is only 20%. You'd give an 80% probability to things working out very well. What does that come from? Is that because you have a sunny disposition, which you certainly seem to have? Or is it based on evidence or having thought through the scenarios?
I think if you see a solution, it's much easier to be optimistic. I think most of the world knows that there's a risk. And when I say most of the world, I mean most of the tech leaders, for example, and most of the AI researchers. I speak at AI conferences and do informal polls. How many people think PDOOM is 90%, 50%, 20%? By the time I get to 20, almost all the hands are up. There's one or two that are holding out and they're like, no, it's 1%. But the vast majority of people who are actually working in the field, there's this cognitive dissonance. They're working in the field, and at the same time, they're saying there's a 20% chance it kills us all. Well, if you don't know what to do about it, you pretty much come to the conclusion, well, I should just work as best I can and do my best to try to make it safe and cross my fingers. And I think that's what the tech leaders are doing. I think that's what the researchers are doing. I'm more optimistic because I see very clearly a way that definitely makes it safer. That's very different than what others are doing. And also from Wall Street, I have a paradigm that says there are no guarantees, but there are probabilities. And so the game is, if the risk is 20%, how do we get it to 19? If it's 19, let's get it to 18. You just try to shift the odds in your favor. That's how all the hedge funds have made their money, not by being 100% right, but by shifting the odds in their favor. And we can do the same thing here. So it's that combination of a framework of how to approach it and also seeing some very clear things that will really help us a lot.
Okay, so let's dig into the reasons why you think superintelligence could be made safe and how you think it could be done. If I understand you correctly, you think we can make it safe by ensuring that it arrives as a community rather than as a singleton, and that'll have internal checks and balances. So why are you confident that that would work out well?
So that's right. So I'll answer that question, and then maybe I'll take a step back, because I think it helps to identify what are the safety risks to then see how do you address those risks. In terms of the community being safe, yes. Just as in a democracy, you have checks and balances. Even though the actors in the democracy are in some sense black boxes, you don't know what's in each person's mind, but you have a set of rules so that when the people interact together, that interaction becomes safe. So this conception of superintelligence, I will contrast to the dominant current view. The dominant current view is you build a large language model, GPT or Gemini or Claude, and you just make it bigger and bigger and bigger, train it with more NVIDIA chips and more data, and it has more parameters, and superintelligence emerges from that. That's the current approach, more or less. There are definitely people doing different things in that, but that's kind of the mainstream approach. The problem with that, number one, is lack of transparency. You're building something that is this giant intelligent model that, if you succeed, will be way smarter than humans, and you will have no idea how it represents its knowledge. It will not be predictable. It will hallucinate, and it will be out of control. You can't control it. So those are all problems. Transparency problem and the control problem. It scales faster and faster. If you just extrapolate the increase in processing power that NVIDIA and others have said, not controversial at all, you can see that there will come a point where the human blinks their eyes and the AI has 200 human lifetimes to think about whatever problem it's thinking about in the time that you have just a chance to blink your eyes. So there's really no chance when you get to that stage of trying to control this thing if it has autonomy and its own goals and so forth. Okay, so those are the problems. Probably one of the biggest ones is transparency and not knowing what's really going on. And that came from the double-edged sword of how we trained our things. So on one hand, the neural network models and connectionist approach and transformer algorithms and machine learning broadly that everybody uses today is wonderful, because all you have to do is shovel data in, shovel the entire internet in, and it automatically learns the patterns. But the problem is you don't really know what it's learning. You just know that, wow, it seems sort of intelligent at the end. It emerges. That was the wonderful thing about that approach to machine learning. But the flip side is it's not transparent. Okay, what if instead of doing that, instead of building the monolithic large language model, superintelligence, we instead take the Minsky idea and we say, you know what? Let's just use the agents that we have right now. They're not that smart. They're still kind of controllable. Yes, they're black boxes. We can't see inside them. But let's put them together on a network as intelligent agents, and let's have rules for the network. And as these agents communicate with each other, that is visible. You can see the communications. Just as in a human democratic society, you can see the actions that individual citizens take. You can see what they say. You can see what they do. You can have laws to constrain bad actors. Similarly, in a networked approach to superintelligence, it's very visible what each of the agents are doing. You can record that. You can audit that. It makes predictability easier. So then we come to your question about, but what if there's bad actors, and what makes you think those checks and balances are going to work? The analogy that I like to use here, which I think your listeners will be familiar with, is Bitcoin. The way that Bitcoin maintains its integrity is by relying on the community to check each time transactions take place. There are difficult problems, and there is a case called a 51% attack, where if you could have the majority of the community or the majority of the computing power controlled by a bad actor, they could actually funnel all the Bitcoin into their pocket. But that has not happened so far. And the reason it hasn't happened is because this community approach seems to work pretty well. Similarly, in democracies, where it's a little bit more questionable in current politics, we won't go there, but so far, at least, humans have not killed everybody. We're killing some people, but not the entire population, a very small percentage. And democracies has survived for hundreds of years, which is to its credit. And so I think there's hope. At least one of the most tested forms of human interaction and organization that we have. So I think a collective intelligence approach a la Minsky could follow some of these things.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's an approach I've heard suggested before. David Brin, the science fiction author, is keen on the same idea. But it seems to me to suffer from the same criticism or same analysis of the risk of superintelligence that every other approach does, which is once this superintelligence has arrived, however it's comprised, whether it's a community of limited agents or whether it's one monolithic model, probably not a large language model, but whatever comes next, once superintelligence has arrived, we are no longer the smartest species on the planet. We are the second smartest species on the planet. We've replaced the chimpanzees in that role. And the smartest species on the planet will be the one that gets to decide what happens, just as we get to decide what happens to chimpanzees now. That could be very uncomfortable for us. It means that we are entirely reliant on them. Now, they may like us, they may love us, they may think that we're their beloved parents or something like that and treat us very, very nicely. Or they may hate us and decide to get rid of us. Or they may be negligent of us and wipe us out accidentally in the way that we do ants when we're building a house. Or they may trolley off on their own and do fascinating things, and we just wither with despair by comparing ourselves with them. There's a whole lot of negative potential outcomes. And I don't see how having a community of AIs avoids that problem. The fundamental problem is us becoming the second smartest species on the planet.
Right. Those are all very valid points. So let me address them. Unfortunately, I don't have the wonderful answer that I wish I had where I can guarantee anything, but I can definitely give you some thoughts on how to shift the probabilities in our favor, which again, back to my Wall Street training, is sort of how I look at this. Let's go back to Herb Simon. There's a brilliant little book. I love little books, and this one really is small. I think it's barely 100 pages, called Reason in Human Affairs. Stanford University Press, I think it's 1984 or something like that. And in this book, Simon says, look, I'm not necessarily going to say a whole lot of new things, but I really want to take this opportunity to sort of reiterate some of the important ideas about human reason and reason in general that I think are very important. And it turns out within this little book, I believe, is the core linchpin that relates to the concern that you just raised. So Simon says in that book, there's a little sentence where he says, reason is wholly instrumental. It cannot tell you where to go. In other words, it can't tell you what's right or wrong or what your goal should be. At best, it can tell you how to get there. That harkens all the way back to the philosopher David Hume, great British philosopher, in his treatise on morals in 1776. I'm not a philosopher, but this particular one I happened to look up to make sure I could see the trace of this, basically saying there's no way to derive what you should do, an ought, from what exists and is. So if we accept Hume and Simon as two smart guys, and they both are saying this, there's no way to rationally derive what is right and what is wrong. That's very important because it means the implications for superintelligence are no matter how brilliant this superintelligence is, let's say it can think 1 trillion lifetimes in the time that we live one. In all those trillion lifetimes of thinking, that logical ability is not going to enable it to come up definitively with this is the right thing and this is the wrong thing. It has to get its values somewhere else. It has to base them in some subjective way. Okay, great. This now opens the possibility that humans can be that source. If you think about where humans get their values, typically it is from their peers, from their parents, from other people. That's where we get our values, our upbringing. I think that this scenario is very analogous to what we're experiencing with advanced AI as it develops. That essentially right now humans are smarter and we are the ones inventing the technologies that enable superintelligence. In the scheme that I'm proposing, where you have a community of intelligent agents, I should point out that some of the agents on that network in that community are humans. In fact, it's critical that as many agents as possible are humans on that network. And without getting into the technical details of it, as the network is solving problems, every time the network gets a problem that it cannot solve, the AIs have never seen this problem before, don't know how to solve it well, humans can jump in and say, here's how you solve it. So the human expertise is being transferred to the AIs over time. So you have humans and AIs learning from each other, mainly the AIs learning from the humans on the network and storing that information. In addition to learning human expertise, those AIs are learning human values. And the longer that humans and AIs are in contact, the greater the probability that those values transmit. So that's the first piece.
Okay. Let's assume, for the sake of argument, that the system works and that we are the source of the ought for the machines. I'm not convinced that's necessarily going to be the case, but let's assume for the sake of argument it is. There's a fundamental problem, which is that there's about 9 billion humans, and we have no agreement among ourselves about what our goals are. Most of us aren't terribly clear about what our own goals are. My goals change from day to day. How would you achieve any kind of consensus about these goals when all the humans don't agree with them?
Perfect. That's part two.
Okay.
It's like we're reading each other's minds here. Part one is the humans are on the network and able to transfer their values over the network. Part two is those AI agents themselves. Each one is personalized. So David has his AI agent that has been personalized just like Meta's talking about personalized superintelligence now. Okay, so great. The world is catching up to this idea. David will have a AI agent personalized not only with David's expertise, but also with David's values. And Callum will have the same, and I will have the same. And rather than 10, 20-something programmers in Silicon Valley writing a constitution for constitutional AI or something that says this is what's right and this is what's wrong for the other 8 billion people, which I really think is not the right approach, we should have a network with millions of people and millions of agents, each one customized and holding the individual values of the owner or the human that was associated with that AI agent. And in that way, you get a broadly representative set of human values. It doesn't completely solve all your problems because in the world today, we still have lots of problems. We have in certain regions, a certain set of laws apply, somewhere else, a different set of cultural norms. So we don't have uniform ethics today. Yet we are not all destroyed. We are not all killing each other completely. Sometimes there's battles.
We very nearly are, sadly. And the more power that's in people's hands, the more dangerous it gets. You said you didn't really want to talk about the mess in American politics, but sadly, that is almost a counterexample to what you're suggesting. There is a breakdown of the system of checks and balances, in part because of a lack of transparency, in part because there's things happening behind the scenes, the manipulation of the Supreme Court, the cowing of members of Congress has lost that multiplicity, that variety. And I fear the same will be the case with AIs, especially when they've got more power. It'll be more of the calculation, hey, I'd better act now to defang that other baby AI over there, otherwise it's going to grow up and defang me. This system of checks and balances presupposes a broad equality, a reasonable equality of different concerns. But in a world where people can gain a significant advantage by a jump up in capability and then taking advantage of that short-term window to annihilate opposition, it's a very dangerous place, sadly.
I share your concerns for sure, and it is a little dismaying, the current state of politics. Nevertheless, humanity exists and is soldiering on, and I am hopeful that better times will come as we have new elections and new leaders. And I guess I would say, again, I don't have a magic perfect answer to this. Humans have been arguing about what's right and what's wrong and what are the proper ways to behave for thousands of years. If all those humans for thousands of years haven't figured out the thing that makes it perfect for everybody, I can't do that either. I think the best that we can hope for is that this approach to superintelligence is a mirror of our values. And I do think, for better or worse, if humans behave badly, AI will behave badly. But if humans behave well and embody those values, and perhaps as our awareness of the stakes is raised and people realize that this is an amplifying technology and that it's not just a matter of you getting more resources or more power than somebody else, but that actually a matter of your survival and everybody's survival, perhaps that will be enough to awaken our better natures and encourage us to behave in positive ways. I don't want to sound naive here, but I'm hopeful that the survival instinct will kick in. So I'm sort of banking on that more than I am on people's altruism.
You talk about hopefully our better natures will come to the fore, but there is an argument that any sufficiently intelligent system will automatically, not a question of being moral or immoral, it will develop various sub-goals, such as self-preservation, such as resource accumulation, such as power accumulation, because in order to do its own goals, whatever they are, it will need these other things. So it's quite logical, in fact, to try and preserve yourself. It's quite logical to try and get sufficient resources so that somebody else over there can't switch you off or deceive you. And so that internal dynamic towards greater power causes inevitably a greater instability. So my recipe is we must avoid a centralization of power. We must avoid any one group or any one AI having too much power. And given the tendency of superintelligence to get more power more quickly, my own view is we should stop any attempts to get superintelligence anytime soon. Which brings me to a question I did want to ask you, which is you may have your own plan to build safe superintelligence, but in the meantime, there's 20 other groups who've got different plans to build superintelligence. How are you going to stop them building their unsafe superintelligence before you get your safe superintelligence onto the table? assuming your one is safe, which I'm still not completely convinced about.
Nor should you be. I'm offering no guarantees. So let's start with, I want to agree emphatically with your idea that distributing the power and avoiding concentration of power is a good thing. I am 100% on board with that. And in fact, this system is an attempt to do that, in that you have many AIs, each of them has a certain amount of power, and it's as widely distributed as possible. As far as systems go, this is as decentralized and distributed as it gets. Now, if it were possible to halt or pause all development, I would probably also be in favor of that. The problem is, I've spent too much time in Silicon Valley and Wall Street, and I can't see that that's practical, nor do I think regulation is going to help us. The problem that I see in the capitalist system, and unfortunately, we just live in this world, so we have to deal with what we live in. What I see is there's too many competitive pressures. You heard maybe Max Tegmark has this great line. It's not an AI arms race, it's a suicide race. But what are the factors that are causing us to engage in this tragedy of the commons, this race to the bottom? Well, if Google slows down, XAI won't, or OpenAI won't. If the US regulates, China won't. Even Jeff Hinton, who has devoted his life at this point to spreading the word about the dangers and trying to raise awareness, has basically said, I didn't sign on to the pause letter because if the US pauses and China doesn't, it doesn't help us. The pragmatic side of me says, it's coming. It's like a baby. The baby's coming. Let's not have it in the parking lot. Let's do the best we can to make it as safe and as decentralized. And all those things that you said, David, I agree with. And if I could stop the baby and give us more time, I would. But I don't think I can. So I'm just trying to make it as safe as possible going forward.
I'm very much inclined to agree with you about that. I think if a pause was possible, it would absolutely be the right thing to do. You can probably tell David's been reading the new book, If Anybody Builds It, Everybody Dies.
Yeah.
In which they say that is the only sensible thing to do. And it's probably true. It is the only sensible thing to do. But I think, Craig, you're right. We are not going to do it. There's just no chance of a pause happening. Therefore, we have to hope that the outcome of the first superintelligence will be good. And it's nice to meet somebody at this time of doom and gloom who shares my view that it's not necessarily a bad outcome. I'm not sure my P-doom is as low as 20%, but it's good to have somebody optimistic about the future of superintelligence on the show.
Craig, you recently attended the AGI conference organised by Ben Gutzel and colleagues in Reykjavik, Iceland. Ben's a long friend of the show. I wonder if anything stood out for you there.
Sure. Yeah. It's funny. I first met Ben in 2001. I was looking back. So there was a conference in Brussels called the Global Brain Conference, first annual Global Brain Conference, and it was organized by Francis Haylion and Ben. That was actually where I presented that early work on PredictWallStreet that I mentioned, where I got these artificially good results. So that's where I first met Ben. At that AGI conference, there's a fellow named Robert Ray. He's with the Center for Integrated Cognition. He's a colleague of John Laird. John Laird and Paul Rosenblum. I think you would really enjoy Paul Rosenblum, especially from concern about rights and consciousness of AI in the future. Paul Rosenblum is on your wavelength, extremely intelligent. He was a student of Alan Newell's at Carnegie Mellon. He's now retired. It's as close as you get to Alan Newell. That's the problem. These guys have passed away. Now you have to deal with the students like me and Paul. But Paul's smarter than me and really on that wavelength, and has written and is writing extensively about AI rights and those kinds of things. Bob Ray is a colleague of that group, and they all worked on the SOAR architecture, which is one of these unified architectures of cognition. So that's the common thread dating back to Carnegie Mellon. So he was at that AGI conference. Bob Ray was. The previous one, John Laird, was there. In fact, that's the reason I went to the AGI conference in Seattle, the one before this. And who else did I like? Tatiana Shravina was a research scientist at Meta doing scientific discovery. I thought she was good. And Henry Minsky, Marvin Minsky's son, he gave a good talk. I think it was called AGI is not child's play, but it should be. The idea there was, we think we have these wonderful machine learning algorithms, but look how much data and computation it takes to get them to behave semi-intelligently. If you compare that to a small child that knows nothing, that small child working with far fewer resources is able to form a lot of concepts much more efficiently than these algorithms. So maybe we should be looking at what humans are doing, and there are other things to sort of discover. His talk was quite interesting as well.
Well, thanks for these pointers. I think Callum and I will be looking more closely to see if we can inspire one or more of them to join us on the show.
Sure. This is great. Having looked at your websites and talked with you both, I really like what you're doing. Please continue. I really want to encourage it. And if I ever get to London, I'll probably give you a heads up and see if I can take you to lunch or something.
Well, that'd be great. I was serious when I said at the beginning, Craig, that if you succeed in what you're doing, it'll probably be the most important thing anybody ever does. So more power to your elbow, as we say over here.
And I'm just trying to influence. Others should pick up any little piece of the idea that maybe resonates and then run with it. I would be happy.
Craig, thank you very much indeed for joining us on the London Futurist podcast.
This has been a lot of fun. I really appreciate the work you guys are doing. So thank you very much for having me.
It's been a real pleasure. Thanks.